Okay, here we go. I've seen quite a few faces that have been to all, well, names that have been to all three of the workshops. So this is bringing it pretty much to a close here from our perspective. We've got a few more weeks, well, a week and a half to get our written reports finalized, but welcome to the last piece. We went through 3 modules already, and this is, of course, being the third workshop. The first about revisiting that transportation land use connection, going back in time to all the core theories that inform the way we think about transportation and its interactions with land use in cities within the urban system of cities. And taking that to the next step of reviewing kind of the current state of things in terms of COVID and its changes to cities alongside new transportation technologies, the role that they are currently having and may likely to have in the future. And then now number 3, bringing it all back together to try and reinterpret that transportation land use connection a little bit, as much as we can, to see if it can inform the way we think about integrated transportation and land use planning in cities going forward in Canada, around the world. Let's see how far we can take it. But again, a lot of the team members are here today. You've seen them across all 3 of the workshops, but they'll certainly be available alongside me to go over some of the findings and Q&A and our final discussion. But let's just do a quick recap. Let's do the looking back and set the stage a little bit. I've shown this graph too many times now, but it encompasses a lot of the key aspects of that transportation land use interaction and the feedback effects of transportation networks and the land use system at the bottom in terms of, well, you've got the networks, and the networks connect the land uses. Those land uses contain activities that people can do things in the different land uses in the built volumes of the city. And together, the transportation and land use system define how we think about accessibility. People have put their own spins on that basic graph in different ways. This fundamentally adopts the same type of structure, although the arrows are reversed in this case, but that the transportation networks directly affect accessibility. I should add, this is Luca Bertolini's work from 2012. And having more accessible land tends to influence where things locate, tends to influence where private companies will build a building, and where tenants that want to run some type of business will locate their shop, or where people will move for their next house. Those land use locations influence the locations of activities, and the activities also influence the transportation network in terms of how people behave, and also where we choose to invest resources into making new transportation infrastructure. And what Luca has added on top of that are some more external effects and time elements of how does accessibility change land use? Well, it's a slow process. Land use tends to change activity patterns in a fast process, because once a building is built, it becomes open for inhabitation in, I guess, a relatively fast way. The location of activities tends to influence transportation networks in a slower way. Networks are slower to respond to the new equilibriums of where people and origins and destinations are located and travel between them, but feedback in that sense, but also in terms of how things like regional demand and land availability, spatial policy and planning, how they affect land use decision-making, how factors like socioeconomic and demographic and cultural aspects affect the patterns and, I suppose, spatial and temporal availability of activities, how technological innovations and infrastructure investments and mobility policies influence transportation networks. I'm going to come back to this later of what could go there, and another, we had a great presentation last week from, I think it's Michael, I forgot the first name, Wegner, but visited U of T virtually, and his version of it looks a lot like this, where you still have the transportation land use interaction in the center, but getting more on the behavioral side now of if you have activity locations and you have transportation accessibility, that combination of land use and transport, how does decision making aggregate within that system to produce certain outcomes? Well, I suppose if we start over here, the accessibility of a piece of land, how accessible it is to labor markets, or how accessible it is to jobs or other types of amenities, that influences the attractiveness of that land for development. Investors make locational decisions based on attractiveness. They might then construct buildings. The users of those buildings pick locations, they move to those buildings, and then activities are set up. And then on the travel side, households or individuals, he starts from a position of car ownership, but I guess the modes that are available to you, you choose to make a trip to a certain activity, pick that destination. Zoom is covering that top, but I believe it is, we've got the destination choice, you've got route choices and mode choices, how you want to travel to that destination. That transfers to different loads on certain links in the transportation network that create, for example, traffic congestion. Traffic congestion influences travel times, and those travel times or costs in turn influence accessibility. And the system goes on and on and on around in circles at the household, individual, property developer level, up to some aggregate process of system-wide feedback loops as people engage in activities, and I suppose people on the development side engage in the land development process. So there's a few different spins on this fundamental transportation land use system, adding more and more detail to help us further understand that system. But fundamentally, it is just about connections between transportation and land use, that they create accessibility and activities and activity patterns, activity participation. And the feedback loops between all of these different elements make it particularly challenging for us to analyze those individual elements in isolation of others. It's tough to look at just the transportation network or mobility changes in isolation without recognizing the changes that a new highway, like a Highway 413, might have on the rest of the urban system and the feedback loops that occur within it. So that's really the fundamentals of, at least graphically, how we think about transportation and land use in cities. But to go in a little bit more detail to further set the stage, a lot of the discussion has always been about transportation costs, in that they're the glue of the city. That if transportation is fundamentally intertwined with land use, the characteristics of that transportation system in some ways define the land uses and the development intensity that we see within cities. So the transportation network, excuse me, I'm just going to cough for a second. The transportation network connects the origins and destinations. It allows us to engage in activities in the land. And the urban forms and functions are shaped by those transportation costs and the accessibility. And we've defined accessibility a few times, well, in the previous two workshops, but just as a reminder, low accessibility is a context much like this, where there's not much in terms of transportation infrastructure or destinations to travel to, versus a high accessibility type of context. There's good transportation infrastructure, the networks are there, and there's lots of different opportunities contained within higher density uses of land that people can travel to and engage with and interact with. High activity, high potential to engage in activities or for interaction in a high accessibility area. Why that matters, though, is we've seen some pretty dramatic shifts in the transportation landscape in cities in the last 100 years, where cities at the turn of the previous century, very high transportation costs. The spatial extent of the city was basically defined by how far you could get by walking, or goods movement by modes like rail or shipping, but very high transportation costs leads to high densities in development, both in land use and transportation network densities. A great advantage for public transport in that type of context, when you had the first streetcar cities take place, the extension of streetcar networks basically unlocks much of the development potential of land in cities at that time. So yeah, really significant changes get brought on by new transportation infrastructure, or infrastructure and technologies within this context, that allow us to propel people and goods over longer and longer distances through better and better machines. And again, it's safe now to assume that relative to 1900, we could pretty much assume that the cost of moving goods and people has become relatively costless. There's still costs involved, but certainly not to the extent that they were that long ago. But that decline in transportation costs is one of the main factors attributed to a very large scale decentralization of people's households and jobs over much of the last century. There's other factors we'll get into, of course, but like demographics. But it's a question of has that transportation cost decline continued, or where is it at today? Cities have not ceased to exist. They just have changed a lot of their functions. Cities today primarily exist to facilitate contact between people, primarily face-to-face contact between people engaging in some activities that a lot of which require face-to-face contact to be accomplished successfully. So there's still poles of centralization, and moving people, while moving goods has declined in terms of cost, moving people is certainly not free. It remains a very large proportion of people's household transportation costs involved with owning a car, travel time, other types of costs, congestion and delay, significant costs as well. So still dealing with high transportation costs for moving people. And despite a lot of really great efforts, some activities still require face-to-face contact, like the transmission of tacit knowledge that's not easy to codify, that requires demonstration, face-to-face contact in terms of receiving the information, but also receiving nonverbal cues through body language, other types of these performative aspects. They don't lend themselves well to an online-only Zoom or Teams environment. That they're still just functions that require us to meet together face-to-face. And if they require face-to-face meeting, there's still going to be some sort of, there's pull effects, that they're going to pull those activities so that they stay in cities. And that's going to require people to travel to those locations to meet face-to-face. So we still have not seen the death of distance that was predicted when fax machines came on the scene. Geography still matters. It's just, for some activities, it now matters less. But we still have agglomeration effects that they continue. People moving costs have not really continued their decline in cities. There's just, cities don't appear to be going anywhere. That brought us into workshop 2 in terms of new transportation technologies, of how we might think about revisiting those core transportation land use interactions, given things like mobility services or mobility as a service. A lot of different terms were thrown around in that workshop, of micromobility, ride hailing, ride sharing, bike sharing, demand responsive transit, and on and on. We had, I think, 30 different terms presented, but to distill that down into some kind of structure, we adopted thinking about those transportation side improvements in terms of, well, we still have the physical network, and we still have the physical modes that operate on the network. That the network includes the rights of way, Historically, we're dealing with transportation networks that are oriented a lot to just car travel and sidewalks for pedestrians. But as we see today now, there's stresses on that design of including bike infrastructure. There may be further stresses on that as we start to get into micro-mobility modes of how do you accommodate e-scooters and other things into that transportation network and the rights of way as they exist. But thinking beyond just the vehicles in terms of now we have mobility services and potentially in the future a larger paradigm shift towards viewing mobility itself as a service. And I'll just break those down individually. But of course, the physical network, the hard infrastructure, the physical modes, and the land uses. Of course, we can't ignore the land uses that house the activities within buildings. Physical modes, the combination of vehicles, infrastructure, control systems, technologies. So a lot of it is road-based, rail-based. We can have sub-modes like electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, connected and autonomous vehicles, on and on and on. One position on this is thinking about it in terms of modes might now be too restrictive of a concept. Perhaps we should reframe our thinking in terms of, rather than just hard modes, we could have means of transport. But the core of it tends to be newer and newer modes of transportation tend to be associated with declines in transportation costs that can act as a push factor in terms of how we organize transportation and land use in cities. If transportation costs decline, just like in the previous century, we might see sort of natural push factors pushing activities further and further out from central cities into more suburban areas, or potentially into different urban forms, maybe more polycentric urban forms. But again, I'm going to return to this later. Our potentially disruptive technologies include those electric vehicles, where you've just changed the engine, you've changed the mode of propulsion. The connected and autonomous vehicles, where I guess potentially moving from a car that can drive itself as you sit in the driver's seat to purely autonomous vehicles that operate themselves and you're just a passenger, as well as sorry, good old Apple mouses, an increase in micromobility modes, big range of which we start to see hitting the streets increasingly in cities today, whether officially through sanctioned means, through programs, or just people buying different micromobility modes, and now they're here. But a great range of new options are available for travel in cities. Taking that up to a level of aggregation, we may then, or we do already have, what we would consider mobility services, operational entities that provide some means by which the trip maker can contract for a service to enable a requested trip. They've got their origin set, destination in mind. How can I complete that A to B trip? A mobility service provider can provide that mobility to complete the trip. It might be using one, or might be using several different modes of transport. Those modes of transport could be external, traditional things we consider like public transit, taxis. They are mobility services fundamentally. You've contracted with the TTC to complete a trip from A to B. It's perhaps not as explicitly as you might do through ride-hailing apps, like an Uber or a Lyft, where you explicitly pick it from the origin to destination, and the vehicle comes and you get in the vehicle. Other takes on that include like demand responsive transit, where we're using smaller transit vehicles to complete more randomized trip patterns for users. But in addition to all the external mobility services, we can still include the personal ones, or the self-supplied mobility services, which could be your household owning a car, or You ride your own bicycle or use your own 2 feet to complete the trip or a trip segment. And again, backing that up a further step, mobility as a service is viewed as a larger paradigm shift in terms of integrating different mobility services in a seamless way, where we could integrate different mobility packages, different alternatives, payment integration, real-time information is built in. It's just a one-stop window into accessing a range of mobility services that allow you to complete a trip, or to complete several trips, or to maybe more in terms of a lifestyle choice as well, where you could potentially live your lifestyle through mobility services rather than having to own your own vehicle. Maybe all of your trip making can be accommodated through a mobility as a service type of framework. And helpful to think about that in terms of different levels, where arguably we're at today about a 0 to 1 in some senses, a level 0 being a single mobility service offered by Uber or Lyft. They're their own thing. Some platforms integrate routing and modal options, but they don't really offer booking or payment options. A good example of that might be Google Maps today, where you can input your origin and destination, and it will plan the trip for you. But often enough, you're responsible for the mobility service side yourself. Now getting into higher levels of aggregation of integrating booking and payment options and routing options for different modes all bundled into one. So it's one service window for accessing different mobility services. Getting into higher levels now of maybe subscription based in a level 3, you could subscribe to the mobility as a service and essentially just live your life through the system. Up to the very highest levels, where now we can institute levers of policy control that recognize pretty much all of the rights of way that are operated on by mobility services are public rights of way, and that there's arguably a strong rationale for the public sector to get further involved in terms of potentially optimizing the outcomes of the transportation system through the mobility as a service framework. You could manage levels of congestion or prioritize certain modes through pricing mechanisms or other different levers that might be pulled to achieve certain outcomes. But currently today, a lot of our mobility services, they operate independently and outside of that larger, fully integrated mass setting. But I don't want to say other than it can be a thing in the future. We might be able to realize this fully integrated mass framework, levels 3 to 4. We also have the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's helpful to think about a lot of that also in terms of transportation costs. The transportation costs involved in moving information and knowledge in this case. And information communication technologies have really helped us to transmit information and to some extent transmit knowledge over great distances without requiring physical travel. Been exacerbated by COVID-19, where we've seen a pretty high level of stress testing of these technologies through work from home policies, work from home preferences on the part of employees or students, the popularity of Zoom and Teams as new transportation technologies fundamentally, but also the reverberating effects of that in terms of locational preferences. See, in a lot of cases, a big push in locational preferences to more suburban, more distant locations. Ridership on transit is way down from where it was in the past and has still not recovered in very meaningful ways today. And who knows what's going to happen in the future with more variants and all of that, but it's a topic for discussion. But I hope that sets the stage for where we arrived at now in terms of, okay, how can we combine these two strands of knowledge and reinterpret those fundamental aspects of how we think about the urban system, and do it in a way where we can potentially change the way we think about integrated systems planning. Well, my take on that, and we haven't had a tremendous amount of time to go over a lot of these conclusions with the whole group, but that's our task now that the semester is winding up for all of us. But I thought a great way to start that is to take these previous models and update them based on what we've learned through module 2, through that work in module 2. And to me, a good way of thinking about this starts with, at the higher level, through Bertolini's previous graph, we still have those fundamentals in place of the transportation network affecting accessibility, affecting land development, activity locations, and then back into the transportation network. But to that, I've just added the role of transportation technologies, transportation land use planning, the same socioeconomic, demographic, cultural factors, the more supply side types of impacts on the land development process in terms of, should back up and say, this is more perhaps a supply side graph of supplying the transportation network and engaging in land use change, supplying the buildings through private development that house the activities. But also in terms of accessibility, taking what we know about, it's not only the transportation network that affects accessibility, but also things like temporal constraints on you have the network as well. There's temporal constraints on the network in terms of transit vehicle scheduling over the course of a day, but also temporal constraints on activities being open and available, like the local store being open and having operating hours. You have the mobility characteristics of the individuals themselves that impact how much of the city they can access and how many activities they can engage in. And in more detail, distilling that down into perhaps a graph that looks like this, where we still have the transportation land use interaction that impacts accessibility and activities, but more in terms of updating Wegener's approach to, well, first of all, Wegener's graph started with fundamentally car ownership and adopted a structure that looks a lot like the 4-step model of transportation planning in terms of trips and how those trips are happen and how they're distributed on the network, changing that and making it more into an activity-based approach where we have people choosing the location of the activities they want to engage in, people or households. They schedule those activities in terms of their time constraints throughout the day. If we start to think ahead in terms of the transportation network, maybe now we have the availability, or maybe we reframe it in terms of mobility services, and later down the line, perhaps mobility as a service. But that leads to a generalization of the transportation mode trip side of this, of just choosing a mobility service to complete that trip. And then the larger aggregation of all of those individual household trips in terms of assigning them to network links, those links having loads on them that affect travel times or travel costs, that in turn affect transportation accessibility. And on the land use side, still needs some work, I think, but that also might reflect how I think in terms of future research, getting more in depth on locational decisions of people and firms, of how they interact with the land use system. But for now, I just have placeholders as accessibility influences the attractiveness of land, which influences the locational decisions of households, of businesses who might move to those locations and provide activities to be engaged in, which then completes back onto the household individual side of how trips occur. And we have fundamentally our transportation system made up of those networks, modes, mobility services, and potentially mobility as a service, if it can be realized, as well as just the fundamental land use aspects of the density of activities, the diversity of activities at a location, urban design types of elements that themselves, the transportation and land use, they fundamentally interact with activity locations, activity participation, and accessibility in the center of all of this. So something I've just was coming up over the last 2 days, and we'll flesh out more in the written report, but eager to get your feedback as well when we get to the Q&A time. But this is one avenue, perhaps, as a reinterpreting of that transportation land use connection as a system schematic, as a system design of how we might adapt some of these models to current and future transportation technologies and land use trends. But that also brings us to a more, using that framework can bring us to some more tentative, again, tentative because we need to refine them with you and as a team, but tentative thematic conclusions we drew out of the research and through the previous 2 workshops that were instrumental in, again, refining our thinking about the academic literature, the knowledge from that, but also how it intersects with planning and practice. So I think a good way into this is just, we always structured the workshops around some big questions. And I've tried to just, through these slides, propose soft answers to these questions. And it got me thinking about Zero Dark 30, that movie where the CIA, no one ever talks in the CIA in terms of indeterministic language. Everything's always probabilities that this event will occur. I like to adopt that kind of phrasing myself in terms of the probablys, the maybes, but because there's always little exceptions to the rules, but working through them at a high level, looking in the past, can transportation, particularly transit, if we build a transit line, can the transit line itself influence land use change? And to me, this is a clear, fairly clear no on that one, that based on past experience, just building transit itself, the situation is no more build it and they will come, because while in theory, one of the key determinants of land use and the development intensity of that land use, in theory, is transportation costs. The issue with that is transportation costs are generally low in contemporary cities, largely because of the ubiquity of auto-based infrastructure. And it's tough for transit to offer a really significant relative increase in accessibility to pieces of land within that context. In years past, when the city was defined for people movement just in terms of walking, or just say walking, and then the streetcar is invented, and now we can take the streetcar. That streetcar innovation unlocked massive accessibility benefits for land, and is fundamental in enabling the development of a lot of those pieces of land a century ago. But that context does not exist anymore. I put probably not, though, because context matters. And a lot of that would come down to traffic congestion, for example. If you take a parallel road, a parallel highway that's heavily congested, and a rail line, and they both go the same direction to major job centers, the level of congestion on that highway might mean that transit does offer a significant accessibility benefit relative to other modes. And the magnitude of that transit effect might be stronger than in some other contexts. But certainly the evidence tends to bear out that massive rail projects like the BART in San Francisco that were expected to that were expected to remake San Francisco around transit station areas and just completely failed to do so. The experience suggests that transit accessibility itself, relative accessibility benefits, are necessary but insufficient condition for driving land use change and development in transit station areas. And that supportive policy and planning is critical. This experience pretty much led to the widespread use of the transit-oriented development model of supportive policy and planning to promote land use changes in transit station areas alongside that accessibility benefit. But of course, other factors that we have in our urban system schematic are also really important, like a strong local economy, growth that's creating demand for construction, for new activities. There's a really strong demographic role to play in all of this. Social and physical characteristics in the station areas, and the availability of land to be developed in those station areas. So yeah, while transit accessibility is important and it's still fundamental, it's just not enough on its own. And I don't know how surprising that result is, but that's setting the stage for the rest of our conclusions. Building on that would be a question of, well, okay, if the transit accessibility benefit isn't huge in magnitude alone, is there a benefit at all? And one of the ways we can measure that benefit, and some of the research I've engaged in the past, is trying to capture the demand for transit through property values, to capture locational advantage through property values, kind of as a proxy for whether transit is offering accessibility benefits that are demanded, that are valued by people and businesses. So is there a role for land value capture when engaging in integrated transportation land use planning for transit specifically? And I would say probably. So while the relative magnitude of transit accessibility benefits may not be massive in the current context, there is still demand. There's still evidence that there is demand for transit accessibility, and it can manifest itself in land value uplift, the bidding up of prices around transit station areas, around the access points of the transit infrastructure. It's a product of transit access that people value the accessibility afforded by transit. But where it gets a bit murky is a lot of that demand is also for transit-oriented development. That people don't necessarily value only transit accessibility in a purely rational choice way of, I have better transit accessibility, now I'm going to move to this transit station area. It's more a lifestyle choice of, you want to live in a transit-oriented development and enjoy the transit access, but also characteristics like higher density, more amenity-rich living, perhaps with pedestrian and cycling-friendly urban design. But going back to the transportation land use connection graph, it's a whole contextual bundle there of transit accessibility and transit-oriented development of access and land use. But research has shown some strong latent demand, including in Canada, that of households that want to live in these types of urban bundles, that transit-oriented development bundles meet their household preferences for urban context. Whether those bundles exist or are affordable or not is a different issue, and it can lead to this existence of what we're calling residential dissonance, where maybe where you ended up living does not perfectly match your preferences for the type of context you would like to live in, and that arguably there's an undersupply for these types of contexts in our housing markets. But to return to land value capture in that sense, to me, this makes large-scale land value capture schemes challenging. For example, the large area tax increment financing zones that were proposed alongside the Smart Track project, where we could put large tax increment financing zones around potential transit stations, but they're defined in this case by polygon areas. To me, one of the trickiest elements with land value capture is just trying to figure out how much value there is to capture. How much uplift would we expect if we built this particular transit project? And how far would it extend from the station? How far what's the rate of decay in that effect as distance increases? Does it go down 1% every 100 meters up to a distance of 800 meters? What's the timing of it? I've engaged in some of this research into land values myself, where this was a paper in Hong Kong, but you see really strong speculative effects in the urban land market occur around transit station areas pretty much as soon as they're announced. That people will know in 5 years or 8 years, 10 years down the line, a functional transit station will be here, and this property will be some distance from it. You start to see bidding up of prices in anticipation of an accessibility benefit. So prices are already being bid up. How does that speculation occur? How does that speculation affect the imposition of a tax increment financing zone, where perhaps it's implemented too late and a lot of the value bidding up has already occurred? There's also, to me, the question of which accessibility benefit are we capturing? Because in that transit-oriented development, that TOD, transportation land use context, you've got the regional access provided by transit, which could be the bulk of what we would think about as an accessibility benefit. But you also have accessibility in terms of local access. Of a household is now able to access more TOD amenities, and it's a more amenity-rich place to live. And we can think about that in terms of accessibility as well. And if that accessibility is also built into house prices, which of those benefits is capturable? Which of them naturally extends to the transit infrastructure? Or do we capture accessibility benefits from transit? Or now are we doing land value capture on transit-oriented development planning? I think this is a question that remains. But that said, beyond the larger scale issues, I think, just working in this area personally, I think there is a strong potential to engage in smaller scale value capture through joint development projects, where it could be air rights sales or leasing above a station, or land banking. That's often land is acquired to build a transit project. We know that land will increase in value from the accessibility benefit. You buy it at pre-rail prices, sell it at post-rail prices, and arguably, if this all works out, there's money to be made there. Or through joint development projects along the lines of Hong Kong's MTR, where building a transit station, a lot of that is fundamentally underground kind of foundational work that could be bundled with building a transit station, but also preparing to have development on top of that station, or development in the station itself, like retail opportunities at concourse level. Just other ways to capitalize on those real estate benefits from the transit infrastructure improvements. So long as that program can scale up to a point where it offsets the costs of administration. This has happened in the past in Washington, where not so many opportunities for joint development and not much revenue is being raised, because a lot of that is offset by staffing costs of having to staff real estate professionals in the transit infrastructure, in the transit provider. All right, skipping gears to the next one. Can we balance land use benefits with social outcomes? My brief conclusion on this is we should try. And we should try because we should try in several ways. I think that first, just acknowledge that there are risks of displacement associated with transit infrastructure projects. and that this displacement can occur in at least two ways. Usually when we talk about transit-oriented gentrification now, it's in terms of transit stations have opened or exist, and it's a process of social change within those transit station area neighborhoods of potentially higher income households outbidding lower income households for those more accessible locations and displacing the low income households to areas without transit accessibility. It can also happen in terms of construction, of just creating the transit line itself. The academic literature is not especially clear on whether the gentrification process is occurring or the extent to which it's occurring, and is a really active ongoing area of scholarship at the moment. So it's not a rule that gentrification happens, but it can, and it should be recognized that there's strong potential for it to happen. And I think we do see some of this in the Toronto case. I was just talking with my colleague Steve Farber this morning, and this might come up again later, but you have the potential for residential gentrification, but also commercial, like the Eglinton Crosstown and all the development that's occurred around the Little Jamaica Strip of businesses essentially being gentrified out of those transit station areas. Or in the Hamilton case, for example, when I talk about construction, the Hamilton LRT required property purchases along the corridor to extend the width of the right-of-way so that the LRT could fit. But that entailed purchasing a lot of buildings along the corridor, and a lot of those buildings, particularly in the east end of Hamilton, housed low-income families that have been displaced from the transit project. So perhaps project evaluations could have sensitivity analysis built in, where we include more scenarios or include income dynamics in those scenarios when evaluating transit projects and their likely impacts. The community benefits discussion is a great one that's occurring more and more often in this region, of trying to empower local communities in the transit investment process, better equip them to resist the forces of change. The United Way, for example, is really active in the Golden Mile area of Scarborough. And another issue in terms of housing affordability is, while we recognize that we need to intensify land uses around transit, arguably perhaps there's too much focus on doing that intensification around new transit infrastructure, where perhaps that new transit station is built in an area where low-income households reside. And that would, if the new transit infrastructure influences gentrification and those households get displaced, that's one thing. But another aspect of that is more emphasis could be paid on creating more equitable outcomes through intensifying wealthier neighborhoods, like the Bloor Danforth subway, which has existed for a long time. It's not new transit infrastructure, but the land uses have not changed around that infrastructure. If they were to intensify, that can create more opportunities for different types of housing in those station areas, in the existing station areas. And will the transportation land use connection weaken over the next decade? Looking ahead, my soft answer on this is probably. COVID-related changes to travel and activities, they stand to risk the relocation of households, where some households may permanently relocate to more suburban or even ex-urban areas. Some workplaces may move as well into areas that were not historically well served by transit, nor could they be well served by mass transit in the future. And we've seen that a pretty large scale demonstration of the effectiveness of work from home technologies to reduce or eliminate the need for travel over space. The but, though, that qualifies that is, through our workshops and through the literature, there is seemingly a consensus that a lot of the changes that have occurred in the last 2 years are likely not to be permanent. Not all workplaces are going to adopt work from home policies, or they might only do so part-time, in that they will still require their employees to come downtown to work jobs there. We must also remember that a lot of this discussion that we've been having has been oriented to employment-based travel, to commuting travel, but cities are a lot more than just workplace commuting travel. Edward Glaser has some research on this, of the consumer city, that cities offer all of these different social functions and consumer functions for people that, if we extended his rationale further, they're likely to still be important in the future, and there'll be continued need for face-to-face contact to engage in some of these activities, or to engage in your daily needs or different social functions. That there's going to be continued pull forces of centralization, that the city is not going to go away despite these changes. Beyond COVID, new transportation technologies also they may reduce transportation costs and may promote suburbanization. Take the example of autonomous vehicles combined with work from home policies and potentially better communication technologies. If there's a scenario where you don't have to drive the car and you can be productive in the vehicle through remote access to work in a car as it transports you to your job, that becomes productive time, and that may result in longer trips being made, or fewer longer trips. And that kind of trip making does fall outside of a lot of the common knowledge we have about travel time budgets and the maximum amount that people will travel in a day. If people are traveling fewer trips but longer trips, I don't know, I think it'll be interesting to see how that data plays out into the future, and how we might rethink how we think about travel time budgets and sort of the upper limits on how much people will travel in cities. But an important issue with new transportation technologies is scale matters. That when we talk about new transportation technologies, are micro-mobility modes, are e-scooters going to lead to mass urbanization? Probably not. The autonomous vehicle scenario is the one where long distance travel can be made faster and easier. But micromobility modes can have a really potentially interesting role to play in different urban forms. And I'll talk about this further on, but perhaps they can help us to urbanize the suburbs around higher order modes, rather than drive a mass exodus of population outside of cities. They could have a smaller spatial scale type of effect. And there's also a really clear role for policy and planning in shaping these outcomes. They're not predetermined outcomes. But last one, to wrap this up, then, thinking 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out, do we need to rethink how this all comes together in terms of how we think about planning for sustainability? And to me, after doing all this work, I think it's a perhaps. Perhaps we do need to rethink sustainability planning for the future. From Wegner's presentation, he had these rules of distilling all that transportation land use system into just some general hard and fast rules that if travel becomes faster or less expensive, people will tend to make more and longer trips and choose more distant locations. People get more affluent. They'll make more and longer trips and choose more distant locations. If people have to work less, they'll make more and longer trips and choose more distant locations. If all of this happens together, people will make more and longer trips and choose more distant locations. So a lot of these seeds are in place for some of these things to occur. And if they do occur, perhaps we're getting into a larger scale societal push. I don't know, a desire towards push factors that maybe they do lead to more acceptance or desire to have a greater spatial decentralization of our cities and activities. On the other hand, I still think many activities will continue to exert those pull effects. There's always going to be a role for higher order mass transit, because to some extent, moving in cities is, as Jarrett Walker says, it's a geometry problem. And that how do you just fit, how do you get movements onto flows, onto networks? And to some extent, it's a geometry problem in terms of the sizing of the vehicles and how many people can fit onto a vehicle. Even if we all had complete electrification of a largely auto-oriented, auto-dependent region, it's still fundamentally trying to move not that many people using a large number of big vehicles. And it's going to be a very high energy intensive types of flows that will require electricity infrastructure and all these sorts of things, but there's still just that fundamental geometry of it, that there's, I think, always going to be a role for rail, higher order, fast, rapid transit. Now, where that leaves the bus, I'm not entirely sure, because bus service may increasingly have to compete with some of those other mobility services for point-to-point trips. We'll come back to that in the discussion, I suppose, but I think planning for accessibility will be key, and it's increasingly the case that we do recognize accessibility as an outcome. Accessibility is nice because it's that combination of transportation and land use in one concept, and planning for accessibility is a better way of analyzing alternatives, of crafting cities so that fundamentally people can engage in activities that they want to engage in. But bigger picture, do we need new urban theory? New urban theory that recognizes some of the big challenges coming up over the next several decades, like a context of slow or no population or economic growth, or the even higher levels of digitalization that are likely to occur in the future, versus climate change and climate change resilience, achieving real sustainability, not just reducing emissions, but real sustainability, and the ethics of achieving that real sustainability so that humanity doesn't face potential extinction or huge loss of biodiversity. And more perspectives weighed in the evaluation of planning and policy alternatives. One idea I've come around to through all of this is perhaps all that comes together through urbanizing the suburbs. We may see that dispersion in locations and activities, but still likely to be a need for amenities, for face-to-face contact, for connections to the larger region, or other amenities like you just want to get out of the house and work at a coffee shop, but of course you live in a more suburban area. Maybe there's some drive here to urbanize the suburbs around a more polycentric urban form, for example, around regional rapid rail as the core of a more polycentric region, connected by micromobility technologies that ease that first last mile problem to the center of those polycentric developments. But this is all TBD. So I don't know, I'd like to open it up now and just collect any thoughts from the group in terms of how we might refine or strengthen these conclusions or refine our thinking. And then jumping ahead, we'll get into the other activity after this, but I don't know, Judy, if you want to hop back in, that's pretty much all I have in terms of the actual core of the report.